Robert Kiyosaki is a renowned investor who in 1997 published his most famous book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. If you're beginning your journey in learning about wealth from a point of view that's very different from what you or I learned in school and potentially at home, then reading this book is a great way to get started. I'm Dan Calonge, and I'm on a mission to help immigrant working professionals grow their wealth passively through real estate. If you'd like a copy of my passive investing guide for immigrant professionals, click in the link down below in the description. Robert talks about his experience growing up with two dads. His biological father, who was very well educated, I think he had a PhD if I'm not mistaken, and his best friend's dad, which was somebody who had an 8th grade education. And it turns out that his own dad was the poor dad, quote unquote, while his friend's dad was the rich dad. Now, how does that make sense? Well, it makes perfect sense to me. You see, our education system, from kindergarten all the way through college, master's, PhD, never teaches you about money or successful habits to grow your wealth. It just doesn't. This was very true in my life as well. I earned an engineering degree, got an MBA from a great school, but I was never taught about growing my own personal wealth. And I'm certain doctors and attorneys aren't taught this at school either. And I haven't found any place that teaches it, which is why topics like this are so important to educate yourself on. Okay, the first big takeaway is that the wealthy don't work for money. Now, that's interesting, right? That's kind of a dichotomy. There's a quote that he says in this section that I really like a lot. The poor and middle class work for money. The wealthy have money work for them. Now, let's give you an example of what this looks like. Now, before we dive into this topic, let's look at this example here. So this is basically what a personal financial statement might look like for an individual or for a family. The top is the income statement. The income statement has income and expenses. Income usually things like salary and such, expenses, things you have to pay, bills, etc. And the bottom is the balance sheet. The balance sheet is basically what assets and liabilities an individual has. Now, one of the really interesting things about this book is the way Robert Kiyosaki defines assets. The way he describes it is that assets put money in your pocket whether or not you work, which is an interesting kind of concept, right? So many of us believe that our house, for example, is an asset. But the way Robert looks at it, the house is not put money in your pocket, so it's not an asset. It's actually a liability in Robert's view, which is interesting, right? A liability is really the opposite. A liability takes money out of your pocket. And that's a pretty simple definition, but it makes a lot of sense. Things that are bringing you income are really the most valued assets you could think of. So now let's look at what it looks like in terms of the cash flow patterns of the poor, the middle class, and the wealthy. Let's start with the cash flow pattern of the poor. So the way cash works with the poor is that they have a job which earns them income as a salary, and then the salary then goes to pay expenses like taxes, rent, food, transportation, etc., and that goes out. So in his salary, out his expenses, really nothing in the bottom there in terms of assets or liabilities, because they're just making do with what they can. Let's look at the cash flow patterns of the middle class. So they have a job as well that provides a salary, but that salary is used to pay for liabilities like car loans, credit card debt, school loans, mortgages. They take on these liabilities that they have to owe, and that money then goes to pay for taxes, car payments, credit card payments, etc., and leaves the family. So that's another interesting observation here, is that there are many people, I'd say a good chunk of our society, that makes money, spends a lot on these liabilities, on things, short-term things, or things that aren't necessarily making money for them, and the money goes out, and there's really no accumulation of assets, which is a big issue when you look at long-term wealth. Now, if we look at cash flow pattern of the wealthy, it's a little different. You can see here. So the very wealthy, the ones that really have this down, their income comes from their assets. The assets provide the income in terms of rental income, dividends, interest, royalties, All that income then is used to pay expenses that are quite minimal, that don't include a lot of liabilities. And the money is spent and that money goes out. Okay, what's really interesting about this is that it's not necessarily the poor that follow the cash flow pattern of the poor, or the middle class that follow the cash flow pattern of the middle class. It's not that aligned. There are people that are very wealthy on paper and they have great jobs, surgeons or high-paid attorneys that make a lot of money, but they follow a cash flow pattern of the middle class, of buying a lot of liabilities, and that's not that uncommon at all. So this is really more of a mindset. Now, obviously, this is very simplified. There's a lot of other details here, but this gets the idea across, the concept across of why investing in assets is so important. The second big takeaway is that we can and should educate ourselves, but it requires action to move the needle. Now, this is true based on learning theory. You see, there's a concept called a learning pyramid that describes how humans tend to learn. If you've never heard of it, it's kind of an insightful thing to know. So this is the learning pyramid. It says that people generally remember about 5% of what they learn from a lecture. They remember 10% of what they read, 20% of what's audio and visual, 30% of things that are demonstrated to them, and then 50% of what they learn through group discussion, 75% through what they actually do, and 90% when they actually get to teach others. The top green area here is what's called passive. This is kind of passive learning. You just sit there and just listen and just take in whatever's given to you. But the stuff in the bottom, the blue layers there, are called active learning. That's where you actually are participating and you're taking part in not just learning, perhaps even doing and teaching. And that doing piece is so important. That's why taking action on a lot of the concepts that are learned is so important, to make sure that you keep that learning and you remember it. So to start, invest more in your financial education than in stocks, real estate, or other markets. I mean, that's what I did. The smarter you are, the better the chance you'll have of beating the odds. I spent thousands of dollars on education and mentorship to develop the knowledge that I have today. And the more I learned, the more I realized how truly oblivious I was to this in my past. You yourself don't need to spend thousands on education, but you do need to do some work to get educated. We're so lucky to live in this time in Earth's history where information on almost any topic is available from experts for free, really. Books, podcasts, YouTube videos are all great ways to begin getting familiar with investing. One quote I love that Robert mentioned in this book is that great opportunities are not seen with your eyes, they're seen with your mind. Most people can't get wealthy because they simply aren't trained financially to see those opportunities that might be right in front of them. One real estate investor that I listened to recently retold a story which I thought was a really good one, where he saw this big plot of land and there was a house on it in a pretty major city in the U.S. and the house was pretty run down, and the way he said it, you know, most people would just look at that and say, well, I'm just going to buy the house, renovate it, and rent it out, and we're good to go. With his experience, he knew, wait a second, there's enough land in that spot where you could add another house behind it. And he did that. He actually created two additional freestanding buildings on that property because it wasn't a very, very dense city. It fit really well, and he was able to drastically increase the value of that property by doing that. That's just something you understand after you understand things like real estate at a deeper level. The third big takeaway that I had that really resonated with me is that the primary difference between a rich person and a poor person is how they manage fear. So Robert says that in all of his years, he's never met a rich person who's never lost money, but he's met a lot of poor people who have never lost a dime through investing, that is. The fear of losing money is real. Everyone has it, even the rich. But it's not the fear that is the problem. It's how you handle fear. It's how you handle losing. It's how you handle failure that makes a difference in one's life. And this is very true outside of investing, just in life in general. It's something that we all need to learn. It's often true in life that winning usually follows losing once you get the hang of things. Before I finally learned to ride a bike, I fell down many times. I often got on my parents' nerves when I played the trumpet as a kid, and as I developed, I turned out to be a pretty good player. Most of us have fallen in love and had our hearts broken. It's part of life. And I'll bet if you ask a very wealthy person whether or not they've lost money, I'll bet they say that they have. But they took the knowledge from that loss and went on to make money in the future. And that's what separates them from the others. So, finally, my favorite quote of the entire book that I just wanted to close with is this. The single most powerful asset we all have is our mind. If it's trained well, we can create enormous wealth. So I hope I've piqued your interest in reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Have you read it? Tell me in the comments. Was it impactful? Let me know what you think. Take care.